Emmanuel Bombande, who is the co-founder of the West African Network for Peacebuilding, otherwise known as WANEP. He is a former employee, I think, and founder also of the Peace Initiative, the MPI Africa, and is a peacebuilding practitioner of several years and an international trainer in conflict. He's worked across the continent and elsewhere. WANEP has the notable recognition of being a close partner of ECOWAS, and actually the peace-building and early warning system they developed has been adopted by governments across West Africa. So he's in a very good position to talk not just only about civil society and what we can do, but also what governments can do. So I'm going to ask him to speak also to the questions that I've asked. What's missing? What is it that you've seen elsewhere that if Kenyans picked and ran with it, this electoral process would actually leave us feeling more confident about the process of elections and the process of electing our leaders? Welcome, Emmanuel.
Thank you so much, my good friend Irungu, for the generous introduction. I appreciate the Nairobi Peace Initiative Africa and our global partnership, and to thank you all for allowing me to invade your space and to stand before you and talk about my own context, which I hope speaks to yours. And in so doing, I'll try to respond to the questions that you have raised. But you see, last night at our hotel, one of the waiters, when he knew I was from Ghana, he came and told me, you know, the Black Stars is my team. I've supported the Black Stars. And you know why? It's because Ghana and Kenya are so interconnected. Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta. Then he said, but I got disappointed with the Black Stars this year. I said, I agree with you. But this morning, I've learned that it's not the interconnection of history between Jomo Kenyatta and Kwame Nkrumah, but it's also the thesis of Dr. Obonyo. I never knew that there is such a parallel between our politics in terms of the ethnic rivalry and the rest of it. And so I stand before you very humble, and I recognize former mentors like Harold Miller and all of you in this room. In order to share my thoughts in this conversation with you, I want to begin with a little conversation with my daughter following the events of 2007. And to be able to appreciate that Irungu already stated that I'm a former staff of the NPI Africa. And I have two daughters and a son, and my two daughters were born in Kenya. So in my house, there's always an argument about those born in Kenya versus the son who was born in Accra. But anyway, we were sitting having a conversation, and my first daughter asked me, Daddy, what is happening in the land of my birth? And that was when we started to see the television images. And so I want to start my conversation with you by saying that on behalf of my daughter, and on behalf of the people of Africa, the people of Kenya owe it to the rest of the continent to ensure that on 4th March, the elections are peaceful. Now, we can talk about the challenges, we can talk about the obstacles, we can talk about the difficulties. But that should not in any way take us away from the focus that on 4th March, the elections should be peaceful. If they have to be peaceful, they have to be credible, they have to be transparent. And a lot has already been shared within that level of thought. Every election is unique. And even in the same country, you can never look at an election to be the same as another. And I remember an interview, former president of Nigeria, Obasanjo, was asked, why Nigeria, you don't seem to get it right? How come your elections always have a problem? And he shouted back, have you ever heard of a perfect election? But then people took him on. We cannot hide behind imperfection to allow violence to permeate our society and to destroy. And Vazu talked a lot about the consequences, so I don't need to repeat that. So it's from this context that in Ghana, we learned a lot from the elections of 2008. And for those of you who remember, in 2008, our late president, may he rest in peace, won the elections by 40,000 votes in the second runoff. That's how close it was. And so if you begin to ask yourself, what is it in our different countries that makes elections unique? We must all appreciate where we come from, and we've heard about that this morning, and to ask ourselves, what is it that is unique that we can bring to each election? And so one thing that was very clear in Ghana was never be complacent that you had it right in past elections. And in the Fourth Republic, we just had the successful election. But in order to ensure that we are learning from the past, each context would be different, and we have to appreciate what that context means. And so for me this morning, as I stand before you, yes, on one hand, we can look at the events of 2007 and 2008 in terms of the violence, but we must celebrate the journey that the people of Kenya made in all the reforms that has brought us to 2013. But what that means is that if on 4th March, we do not see a credible, transparent, and peaceful election, then all the work from 2008 in terms of deepening the democratic space, in terms of the type of political reforms, in terms of your constitution, which started as one of the best in Africa, it will mean that all those efforts were in vain, and we cannot afford to allow that happen. And so in that regard, and speaking now from the experiences of Ghana, we started in 2011 to prepare for the elections in 2012. Now, if that is missing here, we cannot go back, isn't it? Because we are left with 21 days. And just like I've listened very carefully to appreciate here, in Ghana, what emerged, and to my humble opinion, was very significant, was that civil society was contributing on the basis of their expertise. And so what we have done in Ghana, and I'm sure you've done it here, and if you've not done it, it could be one of the missing elements, is that we engage not simply on the basis that we are civil society, but on the basis that in civil society, we also bring expertise. And so we're able to engage politicians and society at large on the basis of our expertise. And to be able to be effective, we created a type of platforms in which different expertise found themselves. So when we talk today about civil society and the media also had their own platform in order to engage with the different components of civil society. And I would speak to some of the key initiatives that speak to these different platforms, or if you would want to call them coalitions. There was an initiative that basically was called the Joint Elections Party Monitoring Project. And I'll speak a little bit to that. There was a platform that was looking at the integrity of the elections themselves. I'll speak to that. And there was a platform that monitored on a day-to-day basis how we're preparing for elections. And in order to be able to see all this inform one another, it was important to clarify assumptions. And I think it's important that we clarify those assumptions. First and foremost, for those of us in the peace-building community, if you are in a standard basic classroom theory about conflict, what we normally begin to discuss about conflict is that when two or more parties perceive or pursue goals that are incompatible, then it is conflict. Elections, by their very nature and character, is conflict, because different parties are trying to pursue the same goal in which somebody must win and somebody should lose. And so there you talk about elections also as conflict. The question then is, how are we conscious about the fact that when we manage elections, we are also managing conflict? And here, to manage conflict in terms of tapping what is constructive in the conflict, which even makes us to improve and be better at peaceful coexistence as people. It doesn't matter our regions or ethnic groups, that we can coexist peacefully. And if we are able to do so, to improve on so many aspects of the image of our country, our communities, and we can make a long list. And so in this clarification of what we call an assumption, we worked to be able to engage in how we are managing the election, which in itself is a conflict. At the level of the media, it was very important to clarify the difference between the state broadcaster, the Ghana Broadcasting Corporation, with its affiliates in the 10 regions, which is the taxpayers' money, the public money that finances it, versus the private media. And so with the Ghana Broadcasting Corporation, the parameters for engaging in the conflict was very clear. There were certain standards. There were negotiations about if you give 5 minutes to this political party in covering their election campaigns, the others are also entitled to the same 5 minutes. The fair and objective coverage, all that has been said here. But at the level of the private media, there was a recognition that some of our private media, for example, Net2 Television, is owned by a politician, a wealthy politician who owns both a television station and a radio station. And for that matter, those stations will be partisan. The question then is, what are the type of standards that compel even the private broadcasters to conform to the rules and regulations? And so just like you have here, we also have a code of conduct for election coverage by the media. Now these codes of conduct become important because they become the tools and the mechanisms that we can hold the media accountable to the practice of professional journalism and to be able to relate to various associations. For example, the Private Broadcasters Association, the Ghana Journalists Association, and the different types of bodies, the National Media Commission that work to regulate the covering of elections. And so let me now proceed in talking about some of the key initiatives and to say that what we found useful in Ghana, and if I were to relate it to how does this speak to your own context, is that we divided the elections into the period before the election, then during the elections itself, and after the elections. And so every activity was defined along these 3 categories. And we would look at some of the key indicators that harness our collective efforts. Now, I'm not sure whether it is missing or it is present, but one helpful thing was that throughout all the efforts, dialogue was critical to how we manage elections in Ghana peacefully. And so at the level of the Electoral Commission and the political parties, we have what we call the Inter-Party Advisory Committee. It is the Inter-Party Advisory Committee that creates the space and the platform for every discussion between the political parties and the Electoral Commission to be able to put in place all the processes towards the elections. How are we going to do that? What was the processes of procurement? Where were you going to procure the machines? Now, do not forget, I talked about elections as conflict. And in conflict, what is often at the core of conflict is not the objective facts, but it's what is subjective, or others would like to call it the level of perception. Now, if some political parties feel that where you were ordering your biometric voter machines to register voters, it's a place they don't know the company that is manufacturing it, you cannot blame them if they have a perception that you have a software in which you will use those machines to cheat them in the elections. And so if we want to talk about transparency as the rule of the game, it starts long before the elections themselves. And each of these inter-party advisory meetings ended with a public communication of the outcomes of the meeting so that the citizenry is involved and engaged. I'll speak quickly about CODEO. CODEO basically monitored or focused on the integrity of the electoral process and less about whether it should be peaceful or not. So in other words, they were monitoring as a civil society organization and in partnership with the media what was the process of biometric registration, what was the conduct of the political parties, all those detailed questions that for the sake of time I should not go into the detail. And on voting day, they created a situation room in which they did a very important exercise called the parallel voter tabulation. Basically, civil society deployed election observers, and I do not mention the full name of CODEO. CODEO basically stands for the Coalition of Domestic Election Observers. Now, if you have it in the reverse, where it is the outside that tells the story and the internal is not sure what happened, then there you have a problem. And that's why it's very important that there must be national capacity for this type of electoral observation. And at the end of the day, the PVT, as we call it, was simply a backup mechanism that simply said, apart from what the Electoral Commission was doing, somebody else was doing exactly the same. Except that this time around, it is not the Electoral Commission. And so their results and their publication of results could confirm or raise issues related to what the Electoral Commission was doing. And in 2008 and in 2012, the similarity was outstanding. And that was important because you had a reference to be able to make an assessment about the integrity of the elections. Then, and this was happening on the campus of the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center, along which we also had the JPEM. And very quickly, the JPEM was coordinated by the organization that I had, which basically was a partnership with UNDP. There was a process of negotiating with the political parties for them to sign a memorandum of understanding that when results begin to come out, their polling agents through the party headquarters would submit the results that the parties are collating into a data center. Where there is disagreement, there is commitment for non-violence for the next step, which will be through the law courts. And so that afforded what I call inter-party cooperation, which in itself was building confidence. And again, if you look at it from the perspective of conflict prevention, it was important for the electorate and the citizenry at large to see the representatives of the political parties in one room, working together, monitoring the results that they were submitting, because that also builds a sense of confidence that we are working together to ensure that at the end of the day, the elections are credible and that everybody is working together. The other important initiative I should talk about briefly is the important work of the Media Foundation for West Africa, an Accra-based media organization that is also civil society. And 6 months before the elections, they launched, first of all, working together with political parties, other civil society organizations. They developed key indicators ranging from what are innuendos to incendiary language to insults and ethnic incitement, and you name it. They monitored this throughout the country on radio and television, and every Friday they published their results. And so what started to happen was that we could monitor which political party was actually generating heat and tension. And society at large could then be critical why that political party was engaged in that type of activity. And that is where I referred to, Dr. Bonyo, your statement. Let me give some of the quick examples. This politician, who is a member of parliament for Asin North in the central region of Ghana, on a very beautiful morning, spoke on one of his own radio stations. And he began, "Today, I declare war in Ghana. I declare war. If you are an Ashanti, look for," and he mentioned the local name. You know, in Ghana, we eat fufu. And fufu, you pound it with the pestle. He said, you look for it. If an ewe or a gang comes into your shop or into your house, knock him on the head. Knock him hard. We will teach them a lesson. Today we declare war. This was life. Amazing. Another amazing thing was, my goodness, the similarity about cattle. Now here it was not the media. It was a politician, a very beautiful woman, who sat on radio and said, were it not for Kwame Nkrumah's policy of free education, people from the north would be cattle rearers and they would not be involved in politics. and went on and on. Some of it is very difficult to appreciate. Now, by the monitoring of this media landscape, it provided us the evidence to engage proactively in demanding the course of action that was necessary to stop this. In the case of the Member of Parliament, the advocacy reached a crescendo to the point in which there was a demand for his arrest. Now, why was that important? It was important for the police to be supported to do their work without them being seen to be taking sides. And you needed to apply what my sister talked about in terms of the respect of the rule of law. And he went into jail for 2 days before he was jailed. And when he was in jail, he then started complaining about how he does not feel well. And people then said, then you must learn how to speak when you address people publicly. The other key component is the Civic Forum Initiative. I'll speak about that briefly and I'll conclude. Now, here you are the combination of governance institutions like the Institute for Democratic Governance, WANEP, the Center for Democratic Governance. And this basically was the preoccupation of a day-to-day monitoring of the electoral process. And that day-to-day monitoring provided the type of perspectives for proactive advocacy and engaging with key stakeholders. For example, convening meetings. So we will create a platform in which the Inspector General of Police will speak to the security of elections and how that will be undertaken. And in Ghana, the security of elections is what is normally referred to as the Joint Elections Security Task Force that is led by the police but supported by the other security agencies. Now, these platforms allowed the public to ask the key questions of concern that for them was important in the preparations towards the elections. Let me give one example. In the 10 regions of Ghana, the regional minister, which I think in Kenya, okay, now it will be a governor. It used to be the provincial commissioner. Now, the regional minister is the head of the Regional Security Council. Now, during elections, since the regional minister is a politician from the ruling party, what is the public perception when that same minister is directing the policies about the security of the elections? So in one of the discussions, we agreed through consensus that during the elections, the police take over the policy directive in addition to their normal operational directives of managing the security of the elections. And the politicians would withdraw because at that point, they are all in competition. So these types of meetings that were convened allowed the critical discourse and dialogue in the preparedness of the elections. Another platform was with the Chief Justice. How are you prepared at the level of the justice system to deal expeditiously with disputes that are likely to emerge? And she will explain and take suggestions that included the manual that the Supreme Court and the Chief Justice's officers published in terms of what they were going to do at the level of ensuring that the elections were conducted. And these were some of the key examples. And on election day, we had a situation room. We deployed civil society observers directly now working in partnership with the media. And that situation room provided the media with a platform to cross-check stories on the field before they went public. And so we were able to manage a story that might create the type of anxiety that can lead to violence. And we had access to the police headquarters situation room in which they could confirm or not a situation that was likely to generate violence that we were looking at. And this allowed us effectively before the elections and on election day to be effective in the way we monitored the elections. Another quick comment would be the role of the Christian Council of Ghana, bringing together religious groups. They formed a group of eminent people, and their role was to be the intermediary between different stakeholders in case there was going to be a problem. And in that way, you could see that everybody was involved in one way or the other. I think I've alluded to what is possibly missing that you might want to see, but what can we learn and replicate from Ghana? The optimism and the sense of purpose that 4th March will be a peaceful election is important. I think the media needs to project that optimism. If we get stuck with what happened in 2007, which for a good reason, we have reason to believe that we must look at what happened. But we must project now the positive story about how prepared we are and how we must be optimistic on the 4th of March. But I'm not in any way underestimating the challenges that are prevailing. I said that we must project optimism in order that the people from the rural communities to the cities see elections as an important civic responsibility in which all of us have a role to play, and it does not need to be violent. And in projecting that optimism, I already talked about how we must not be complacent, and some of the earlier speakers have talked about that and have underlined that very well. Now, our challenge that you should not replicate was that in the Inter-Party Advisory Committee meetings, they agreed that apart from going through a biometric voter registration, on voting day, we must have the verification of the voter before voting. So we were moving from your ID card with your photo on your ID card to say that you present your ID card, and there were these machines in which you put your thumb, and the machine should pick your biometric and verify you. And if the green light does not pop up and say you are verified, you are not allowed to vote. But this is where we had a challenge between the combination of technology and the manual system. Because in many places on day one, the machines simply got frozen. And we found out later on that if you were to wait for the batteries to completely be exhausted and you change the battery, what happened was that each machine, they loaded the database of the polling stations in that particular constituency. So if you had 5,000 voters in a particular location and you allow the battery to go down completely, when you change the batteries, it takes quite a bit of time for it to reboot and bring back the memory of all the 5,000 before it becomes functional. And so on the first day of voting by evening, there were so many people in the queues. And so a decision was made to go into the second day of voting. But luckily, in the bill that defined how the election should be organized, room was made that elections can go on for 7 days to meet all the constitutional requirements. They should work. Otherwise, then it can constitute a problem. I think that in Ghana, the conduct of the media was vastly improved in 2012 than in 2008 because of all these types of interventions I spoke about. The security agencies, they excelled in their professionalism and everybody admired their role. The roles of CSOs in the media, in my view, was very, very critical. But my conclusion is simple. By acknowledging that every election would have its unique problem, and because Ghana was never complacent, what happened at the end of the day was that because the elections were transparent, because they were credible, because they were peaceful, no candidate could resort to any form of violence. Because the next step, if you are not satisfied, was to go to the law courts, which is spelled out very clearly as the last, so to speak, end of the spectrum in the management of election. The candidate of the largest opposition party says that he must go to court because he wants to make sure that his results were not tampered with. And so he went to court. But then the Electoral Commission wanted to know what exactly are the irregularities that you have pointed out. And he turned around and said, can the Electoral Commission provide me with all the documentation that we call the pink sheets? And the Electoral Commission says every political party picked that on day one, both at the polling station level, to the constituency level, to the strong room of the headquarters of the Electoral Commission. And so the situation now is that the Supreme Court has compelled the opposition party to clearly spell out what were the irregularities so that the Electoral Commission can defend itself. I conclude on this note because had we not ensured this transparent process on the basis of what they believe was an irregularity, Ghana could have gone into violence. But nobody would allow that to happen precisely because there was nothing wrong with the elections. But if you are still dissatisfied, let the courts make the decision. So that at the end of the day, whatever is the dissatisfaction, let the courts make the determination. And this is what has brought Ghana out. And we hope that in 2016, it will still be a better election. Thank you so much.
Presidential candidates, you forget about the owners of the media house that you come from. You forget about the international donors who give you your funding. But if the credibility and the integrity of the elections that's coming up in the next 21 days relied on 30 people in this